away, Mike.
Thank you much. Yes, it's living proof that if you work at a nuclear power plant and you complain the most about how bad the power plant documentation is, they put you in charge of the Tech Pub library. And I've been in a whole new career path ever since. So that's how a crazy guy with physics not only ends up in technical writing, but the software side. All right. So this is a bit of a challenge of a session. This started off as a 4-hour workshop, which was then trimmed to a 60-minute presentation, which has now been trimmed to a 40-minute presentation. So I do want to start by setting expectations. I'm going to introduce responsive design, the key concepts, the methodologies to follow, but it's not going to be anything I would expect you to copy and paste into your work back at home. It's really to drop the keywords, the concepts, so you can do further research on your own. But half the battle is just knowing what to study, knowing what to search for. So that's the goal of the session. Having said that, how many people here will panic and run for the door if I show code samples? Nobody. Okay, a couple. Fair warning, I have a few code samples I'm going to show. So if this is not your cup of tea, there are 2 other sessions going on. All right, so that's the fair warning there. Having also, I realize these monitors might be a little bit small for the code sample bits. I'll be describing them as best I can. I am happy to share my slides with anybody who wants them. My email address is on screen. It's kind of small. It's mhamilton, just M-H-A-M-I-L-T-O-N, or you can grab my business card up in the exhibit area if you want, and it's at madcapsoftware.com, just all one word. Drop me an email. I will not email you the slide deck. It's a little bit big for that, but I have it set up as a download. I'll just send you the link for the download. Alrighty, so with that, what are we going to cover very quickly at a high level? And my clicker has decided to stop working. Okay, back to manual mode. So the agenda. What is responsive design? That might be a little basic for some of you, but I want to make sure that as a group, we're all talking the same vocabulary. Once we define it, what are the core components? One of the things you'll find in this industry rarely is something completely brand new. It usually builds on existing technologies. Responsive design is no different. What is the role of content structure? What is the need to kind of watch our structure if responsive design is the end goal? What is the role of CSS? And then what is the role of media queries? Now, structure and CSS, as I mentioned, those are not new technologies. We're building on existing tech. But the media queries, that's the new piece. Then we're going to talk about strategies. So those are the enabling technologies. How do we now implement? And then we'll talk about some short-term techniques. I hate doing a session that's all theory and people walk away thinking, okay, this is great for 3 years from now. So I also peppered in a couple of techniques that you can go home and do tomorrow if you want. Now, they're not technically responsive design. They're kind of responsive design minus. It's ways to take existing content that may not be optimized for something like a smartphone, but at least making it functional on a small screen without a complete redesign and a rewrite. Then we'll talk about long-term plans, how you'd actually implement a responsive design strategy. And then we'll also talk about the missing link. Now, something a lot of vendors will rarely tell you, responsive design, to use an American phrase, is not fully baked yet. There are a couple of pieces we really wish we had that just aren't there yet. So what does the future of responsive design look like? All right, so that's a lot to push into 40 minutes. So what is responsive design? Well, there's a web designer by the name of Ethan Marcotte who was doing a bit of research and was working with clients, and actually was getting tired of customers, this is a few years ago, saying, the website you designed is brilliant. We now want an iPhone version of the website. And he kept going through these contracts where he would make the main version and a smartphone version. A main version, he kept duplicating all of these websites. So he actually did a bit of research and wrote a paper on the subject. And again, when I share these slides, all these links are active. You can actually see the paper that Ethan wrote. But he came up with a design concept to address what at that point he called stress points. Now that is outdated language. There's going to be some new language introduced later, but that's the term he used. And what he basically said, at what point does your main web page start to fall apart on a smaller screen? And he termed that point a stress point. And so rather than creating multiple versions, he thought, how do we deal with these stress points? Now, what responsive design is not, it's not a smaller version of your page. How many people who carry smartphones have gone to a page and the whole page is there, but it's microscopic? I mean, you're zooming in, zooming out, zooming in, zooming. That is not responsive design. It's not removing content to fit. It's like if you go to the web page, here's 20 paragraphs. If you go to the smartphone version, here's 3 paragraphs. Hiding content from the customer, unless you're using, discovery techniques to allow them to still reach that content, just removing content is not responsive design. And it's not doing an iPad version, an iPhone version, a Samsung version. It's not a separate version for each and every device out there. Now, I really couldn't find a truly good definition, so this is Mike Hamilton, completely made up. You are more than welcome to argue and fight with me over it. But the way I define it, it's a single version of your content delivered to your customer in a way that is easily understood no matter what device they're using. Now notice, nowhere in there do I say anything about it's going to look the same. And marketing people freak out. They want to control look, they want to control feel. That kind of goes out the window. Can we make it look good? Absolutely. Is it going to look the same on every device? Not necessarily. The key thing is, can the customer succeed with whatever the task at hand is with our content, no matter what device they're using? To me, that's the ultimate goal. Pretty becomes secondary to success. All right, so responsive design the easy way. This is just a slide to say what I'm about to show. These are the techniques if you're doing it completely by hand. If you're using a commercial tool set, there's probably a lot of automation built in already. Explore that. For all of you that were actually coming to hear the Flare guy talk about Flare techniques, I apologize. That's the only slide that's even going to mention my own product line. This is going to be much more generic. All right, so the components of responsive design. Document structure. We need to make sure that we set up our content in a way that we can modify dynamically. The style sheet, and here is probably the weakest part for a lot of the people in our industry. You truly need to know your CSS skills to leverage responsive design. And that's something that I think a lot of people, they come to this thinking, oh yeah, I was a style expert in Word for 20 years. I know everything I need to know about styling. CSS is a completely different language. Many things were going to be implemented in radically different ways than we would in a word processor. And then the new bit, media queries. So that's actually kind of the secret sauce, as they would say in the United States, that takes structure in CSS and allows us to dynamically manipulate content now. All right, so when I talk about structure, what am I talking about? Well, if the goal is targeting multiple devices, then as the saying goes, less is more. Minimalist writing, whole other subject we aren't going to go deep into here, but we don't want to have a lot of extra extraneous content, just right to the point. Keep formatting out of the core document. And that goes way beyond, no bold, no inline underscores, no inline italics. It even comes down to things like images. You don't want to manually size an image on a page. You want to control it from an external style sheet. So we all know that, bold and italic is evil, mean, and nasty. But beyond that, your tables, your images, all of that needs to be controlled through CSS. And one of my favorite pet peeves, I'm sure nobody in the room does this, but there was an old webmaster trick where they would actually put an invisible table on the page and hide images and links in different cells of the table to get some beautiful looking format. Completely defeats responsive design. That's fixed formatting. Once you start putting in hidden tables and things, you're stuck with that look, feel, and layout. So again, we want to keep the formatting out of the document. If you're not sure what I mean by that, when I talk about a hidden table, something that might be a bit tricky in CSS that would be easy in a word processor, well, what if I have 5 images, but I want them balanced like you see on screen right now? What a lot of people will do, and it's faint, it's probably hard to see, so let me bold this up a bit and make it colored. They'll put in a 2-row table. They'll do some merging and splitting. So my table has 2 cells on the top, 3 cells on the bottom, and they'll put an image in each cell. That gets the look that they want, temporarily. It works great on a desktop. But now the boss says, oh, this needs to work on a smartphone. I'm now doomed. I've locked myself into this one formatting, this one look and feel. So that's an example of we don't want to use those old sneaky webmaster techniques like hidden tables. Other items to avoid. If you use a lot of divs, you don't want to have fixed sizes in the document. Controlling them externally by a style sheet, not a problem. Like I mentioned, we don't want images inline formatted. We don't want any inline formatting or sizing in the document itself. Everything controlled externally by the style sheet. And this is one of my favorite techniques. I know as writers, a lot of us coming out of the desktop publishing world, we want to see what the customer's going to see. WYSIWYG was a big selling point for years. That no longer exists. In fact, the more comfortable you are just writing in something that looks like this, just pure raw content. Take care of the formatting later. The more comfortable you are kind of reverting back to that workflow, it actually is easier to do the responsive design work. All right, so that's just a bit of a plug about structure and keeping the inline formatting out. Now, the second leg of the responsive design stool is the cascading style sheet. We want all look, feel, and formatting in the style sheet, not in the document. All of our block level formatting, your paragraphs and your headers, your character level formatting, your span elements, and any of your grouping or formatting, your div elements. So we can still have all the styling we want, it's just controlled in an external manner. So that document we looked at earlier, at authoring mode, again, if I'm comfortable with this, that's brilliant. But then at publishing mode, that's when we can add in the block level elements, the span level elements, and then even the grouping or the div level elements. But this all happens at a publishing or a production time, not at authoring time. All right, so structure, CSS, and I realized that was the shortest overview. CSS, there's entire, multiple day courses on that. So I'm going to give you a couple of study resources there if your CSS is a little bit weak. But now this is truly the new bit. This is what has opened the door to responsive design, this idea of a media query. It's part of the Cascading Style Sheet 3 specification, so it's actually been around a fair bit, but it wasn't until the browsers caught up and started supporting it that it truly started being used. It is derived from the old media types. So if you've ever used media types, you're halfway there. The problem with media types is, for example, there's an @print media type in CSS2. But that means you only get one print document. If you have to support an A4 document, a pamphlet, a handout, an insert for a DVD case, it's tough to manage all of that because there's just this one @print media type. Well, that's what media queries were meant to solve. It takes that media type and extends it. So in this case, and I warned you about the code samples, and I realized that's going to be awfully tiny. So just think concepts here. The specific code doesn't really matter. But I have @media screen. So this is only if it's on a computer screen or a tablet screen or something like that. Now I'm setting on my body element some color, some text, font type, and some size. And now I have @media print, and I'll do the same setting. So right now I've got black text in Verdana for online. I have black text in Times New Roman for going to print. That's the old method. But it assumes one screen presentation, one print presentation, ever. And that just doesn't work anymore. So when we start adding the media queries, we can actually test the parameters of the specific device we're rendering on. And then based on the information we get back, we can actually adjust the style information in real time. So if it says, oh, I'm on a tablet, then we can automatically adjust the text to be larger or smaller if we want to. So it can be truly a customized experience. Now, again, this is probably too small, so big picture. It starts with a media type, @media screen, but here's where it becomes a query. It says, and max width 480 pixels. So it's basically saying, is this a smartphone? Is it 480 pixels or smaller? If so, I want the background of the page to be yellow. Then I have a media query. Again, it's media screen, and minimum width, 481 pixels, maximum width, 650 pixels. And those are just arbitrary numbers I grabbed because I wasn't sure the resolution of the projector or screen I might be using. So I'm simulating that's my tablet mode. And that's going to change the background to red. And now here at the bottom, @media screen, minimum width, 651 pixels. That assumes a desktop. Background color green. So with these three queries, I can now change my formatting on page load, no matter what the device is. So the way this works, again, if it's a narrow screen like a phone, I've changed the background color to yellow. If it loads on a mid-sized screen, such as a tablet, I've changed the background to red. And on a full-size desktop, it goes green. Now, I realize that's kind of a silly example, but if I can control the background of the page, I can control any other style element on the page. So I was just trying to find an example that would be easy to see from the back of the room. And now to see this live, I did mock up a little page here. So this is running in Internet Explorer. So if it's in a full-size browser, the background is green. If this loads on a tablet, it automatically goes red. And if somebody else loads this page on a phone, it goes yellow. So now I've done nothing to pre-build 3 versions or anything else. I built one version, but I said, if it falls within these parameters, then change my styles appropriately. And I realized I glossed over a lot of technical details there. Like I mentioned, this is to drop seeds, plant seeds for more research. But this is actually not that hard to do once you do a bit of study. All right, so what can media queries test for? And I'm the first to admit, in the early days of responsive design, testing for, pixel widths was pretty much what everybody did. And that worked fairly well. And then this little silly computer company named after a piece of fruit came up with the retina display and mucked up the whole works. So we can't really rely on pixel size anymore. So what are the things that we can test? Well, width and height, obviously what I just demonstrated. That's the display area. We can check for the width and height of the device itself. You can quiz for orientation. Is it portrait or landscape mode, if that matters to the display of your content? You can determine aspect ratio. Is it a widescreen display? Is it a standard display? But probably the most important one, they call it resolution. I call it pixel density. And this is where those retina displays come in. I will probably render my content very differently on a high definition screen if that high definition screen is a 24-inch desktop monitor or a 6-inch phone. Because that's the challenge with things like the retina display. You now have tiny 6-inch phone screens that can handle more pixels than a big 24-inch monitor. So this will actually tell you how many pixels per inch on that particular display. That gets a little more advanced, but it's something you can detect. Make sense so far? All right, good, everybody's with me. All right, so responsive design strategies. That's a rough overview of the mechanisms we can use. The strategies have evolved considerably. First, focus on content areas. And I admit some of this was really designed more for web pages, but it still can be applied to technical documents. So instead of thinking of your content as one massive linear flow, think of it as, text instructions, figures, table data. Think of it as kind of in modules, and then what we can do is set up almost a grid. So maybe on a full desktop, we want this big header, and then content area 1, content area 2, and content area 3. I have the luxury of a big screen, I can do that. But what if this thing gets rendered on a tablet in portrait mode? Well, I might have to rethink my grid. We might want to do header, important steps, content 1, and then reference data in content 2 and content 3. And if it's on even a smaller screen like a smartphone, well, then maybe it just becomes a linear progression of content. But it's thinking of our content in kind of modules now. Now, the way we control this, and again, this was originally called stress points in the original analysis, that has evolved in the industry to become known as breakpoints. What are the breakpoints where I want to switch my display, my presentation? So breakpoints are the actual values you plug into your media queries. Now, the old school method was to define your breakpoints for the resolution of common devices. And there are still people who do this. It's like, okay, I have the web mode for the desktops, and then I have the iPad version. What's the resolution of an iPad? That's my breakpoint. A lot of technical people, IT department type people, will recommend that. Horrible idea. Horrible idea. Why? Well, a lot of the industry has evolved past that because let's look at just one phone provider, HTC. They're not the biggest, they're not the smallest, but they make a lot of phones. Let's look at just one phone operating system, Android. HTC has 12 different screen sizes and resolutions just for Android phones. So we've got to a point where if you're trying to target physical hardware, it just gets to a level of crazy, trying to accommodate all these devices. There are just way too many devices, way too many different resolutions. And if you want to do the research, there are over 31 different resolutions currently being used in the industry for all of these different devices. So chasing hardware gets very difficult. Now, let me do a sidebar for a minute. This is also where you have to know your audience. If you're writing for the general public and you don't know what device they're going to use, then I would not target devices. However, if you're writing for your company, you're writing for field service engineers who are all going to be using company hardware, it's all the same iPad that gets issued to everybody, well, then you might want to. But that's a very controlled environment. That's the only time I might rethink the strategy. But for now, I would not target hardware. So what would I do instead? Well, this is probably the most recent strategy. Determine the minimum and maximum widths you plan to support. Some customers never plan to support phones, but they do plan to support tablets. That's a business decision. Nothing wrong with that. But have that discussion before you try to build anything. What's the largest screen we want to support? What's the smallest? Then put some of your content into a browser and start resizing the browser. And then figure out, where does your content break? So forget hardware, focus on your existing content. Now what I mean by that, let me pull up a sample here. So here I have a page and I have this image with all of these planets, and I like the way it looks. Okay, this is what I want. Only when people start going to some smaller and smaller screens, at some point I start covering up my image, and people are going to have to start side scrolling, and that's not great. So what I would do, I would resize my browser until I get just to the point where it still looks acceptable to me. Now, what is the width of that browser? Now, there are ways to turn this on in the developer tools in the browser, but a quick sneaky method, there are dedicated websites out there that if you go to them, they will actually report your browser is 871 pixels wide. So that's a quick, easy way to extract that data. So for that page right there, I would add a breakpoint for 871 pixels. Anything smaller than that, I'm not going to be able to use that big graphic. So that's what I recommend. Don't chase hardware, chase your actual physical content. The other thing I would do in this case, take that big image with the 5 planets, break it into smaller images, and add CSS data. Now, for those of you who are a little more advanced, may have done this once or twice, ignore some of my code. I've intentionally made it as overly simplistic as possible so I can have the minimum number of lines. But it doesn't scale necessarily. This is purely for demonstration, and I recognize that. So in this case, we'll skip over some of that. So I've actually added a media query now where I've told it, if I'm on a very small screen, I'm taking these 5 individual images and just center aligning them. So obviously this wide display is not going to work on a smartphone, so I've broken it into 5 images and I will stack them vertically. So if we launch this in a browser on a smartphone, well, instead of a big long image, I have my 5 images stacked up for me now. That's acceptable. But that might look a bit silly on a tablet because I'd have so much space on the sides. So what I can do in the next example, I can do another media query, only this time I've added some float attributes to some of them. So it's just basically a little bit of CSS to balance things out a bit. So now if I go into tablet mode, it will now do this multi-column stack for me, if that's what I want. That's just one example. And then for the full width browser, I can actually detect the width of the screen, float everything left, oops, back up, and that ends up giving me basically the original image that I started with. Now, it's still 5 individual images. I'm just stacking them horizontally now. So now I have one page, one set of images that will dynamically adjust for the different type of devices. And again, if you download the slide deck, take the concept from these examples, not necessarily the actual live code. Some of this is overly simplistic. All right, short-term technique while striving for responsive design. What could you, this is all kind of theoretical. What could you do tomorrow? Well, first of all, brush up on your CSS skills. And if you haven't used the div element, it's a grouping element in CSS and HTML5 that really becomes your friend. You can wrap all kinds of content with a div and name it, steps, name it figures, name it whatever you need, and then you can control that whole content area as a section. And a very short-term, crude workaround. Technically, this is not responsive design at all, but I have a lot of customers that just don't know what to do. This content was written 8 years ago. They didn't even know it was going to have to go on a phone someday, and there's no time to go rewrite everything. Well, those div elements I mentioned earlier, there's a really crude, almost guerrilla tactic. I create a div style called div.rd overflow, responsive design overflow. This is a hack, but it gets something functional at least. Now, what I do on my style sheet, I just add one style property, overflow, auto. Now, what in the world does that do? Well, what that does for me is now anything I wrap with that div, maybe I have a big table and it's just way too wide to fit on a smartphone. Well, that one little trick, here are 2 different tables. The upper table is a normal table. It just runs off the edge of the screen. This lower table I've wrapped with that div.rd overflow, and now the table gets a horizontal scroll bar of its own. So admittedly, it's a short-term hack, but if you do have content you just are not going to be able to rewrite in the short term, you can now apply one additional style with one additional div element to at least make it accessible to a touch type interface on a small device. So that's the one little thing I always like to give people, something they can take away with them immediately. So long-term recommendations, study and practice. That's what a lot of this comes down to. It's nothing you'll be able to do immediately. Suggested reading list. If you want to brush up on your CSS skills, one of my favorite books for CSS is Cascading Style Sheets, Designing for the Web. It's by Lee and Boz. And the reason I love this book, well, A, it's a short, easy read, but these are the 2 gentlemen who actually invented CSS for the World Wide Web Consortium. So not only do they tell you how it works, but they give you a bit of background. It's like, okay, here is how this property works, and we realize it seems a little bit crazy, but we had to make it a bit crazy so it didn't break this other thing over here. And just having that bit of background really helps me to understand some of the mechanisms. So that's a good book. Now, it is a bit of a quick read. So my other go-to manual is the O'Reilly book. Very thick, It holds the desk down in a storm quite nicely. But if I need something that isn't in the original book, then that's usually what I go to. And I did want to include a responsive design book, but to be honest, a lot of the best responsive design techniques are found online these days. It's so new, there just aren't a lot of really great books published yet. So in that case, Google searches are typically your friend. All right, to wrap up, responsive design, we looked at where it came from, the original research, what are the core components, structure of the page, keeping formatting out of the documents themselves, the CSS, controlling the look and feel, and then those new media queries allowing us to change that CSS. Design strategies, you can chase hardware or you can chase content. Short-term techniques, we talked about that div option, and then long-term plans for additional research and study. And I can't believe it, we pulled that in under 40 minutes. All right. So now, before we take questions, I'm going to interject 1 minute of crass commercialism. I know I'm horrible.
I'm shocked.
If you haven't heard, we're giving away a copy of Flare at the show. I already have 20, 25 people who have entered. If you want to enter, I will pass some cards around and you can fill those out. I plan to pull the winner before we leave this room. Now, the winner may not be here, but I'm hoping one of you know the winner, will tell them, and they can come get the software from me. So that's the end of my crass commercialism. I'll hand these out while you guys ask questions. Just in case you want. Oh, come on, somebody has to have questions.
Can I have my money back on the player I've just bought if I win this?
If you win that, could you have your money back? You'd have to talk to sales, but I do know they're open to horse trading, as they would say. Maybe a bit of training instead of product. Well, if there are no questions, that scares me. Did I go through that way too fast?
If you've got existing CSSs, how easy is it to actually adapt them to use the responsive design? Is it just a case of adding the right bits in, or is it a complete rethink?
Good question. If you have existing CSS, how much work is it to modify those? Bit of a trick question. However, what I've generally found, well, let me back up a little bit. I demonstrated kind of 3 samples: desktop, tablet, phone. You're not limited to that. You could do desktop, high-resolution tablets, low-resolution tablets, and phones if you wanted to. So there's no limit. So that's probably the first question. As a team, define, how many breakpoints do we need? Then your desktop breakpoint can usually encapsulate all of your existing CSS. If it's already working on the desktop, no reason to rework it at all. And when you start looking at the other breakpoints, the other media queries, you don't have to rewrite the entire style sheet, just the bits that have to adapt. So that's kind of the strategy side, is first figuring out what do we have to change, and then implementing those changes around the existing styling. I do admit it's easier to start the brand new project, but it can be done with existing content without too much, horrible work. But that also assumes it was styled properly in the first place without a lot of inline formatting to deal with. That's usually the bigger issue. Other questions, comments? Alrighty, well then, I think we're at 11:40 exactly, but I don't see the next presenter waiting to jack in real quick. So if anybody wanted to fill out one of those cards, I'll collect those up now.